Good evening. I want to welcome you all to this evening's debate. In the words of Dr. Bart Ehrman, Jesus is the most important historical figure in the history of the West. The primary sources we have for Jesus are the four Gospels found in the New Testament, and many people today think these documents are historically reliable. Many don't. But I think we should keep in mind what the French writer Joseph Joubert once said: "It is better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it." And the question we ask this evening is, are the Gospels historically reliable? You as the audience have the pleasure of sitting back and witnessing this question being debated between two top historians who specialize on the topic at hand. I'm grateful you have chosen to come to this debate in your pursuit of truth, so thank you for coming. My name is Jonathan Mann. I'm the student president of Ratio Christi here at Kennesaw State University. Ratio Christi is a student organization that evaluates the truth claims of Christianity through examining the evidence. We host weekly meetings where we have guest lecturers or open discussions every week at 7:30 p.m. in the Social Sciences Building, room 3028, and everyone is welcome to attend and engage in the discussion. We are honored to co-host this debate with the KSU History Club. This is a student organization that provides students with the opportunity to attend history-related events such as visiting local museums, historical sites, and hosting group research projects. This group also connects students with professors from the history department and aids students in building their resumes for graduate school. So I would like to thank the KSU History Club for all of their support in making this event happen. I would like to thank the Kennesaw State University College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Student Activities Budget Advisory Committee for their generous support in making this event possible. I would also like to thank Ratio Christi at KSU Director Duke Hale, Faculty Advisor Dr. Victor Marshall, and the student officers for all of their efforts in making this event happen, Vice President Eric Mattson, Secretary and Reservation Delegate Zach Bohannon, Treasurer Keaton Brumley, and the marketing officers Gracie Ernest and McLean Henry. Finally, I would like to thank this evening's moderator, Dr. Brian Swain, and the debaters for being willing to participate in this debate, Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Michael Licona. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Brian Swain. Dr. Swain is a historian of the ancient Mediterranean world. Here at KSU, he teaches courses on the Greek, Roman, and medieval pasts, and on pre-modern history more broadly. Dr. Swain received his doctoral training in Greek and Roman history at The Ohio State University, and he is a specialist in late antiquity, 300 to 700 AD. And I have had the pleasure of having him as my professor for a number of classes here, and I could personally attest that he is one of the best that KSU has to offer. Please welcome Dr. Brian Swain.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to Kennesaw State University and to tonight's exciting debate. I'm Brian Swain, professor of ancient Greek and Roman history here at Kennesaw State University, and I'm honored to have been asked to be tonight's moderator. I would like to thank the student organizations Ratio Christi and the KSU History Club for hosting this event, and special thanks to two students in particular, Jonathan Mann and Eric Mattson, who have shown such savvy and determination in planning this event. Thank you very, very much indeed. I wish also to thank Dean Robin Dorff of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and thanks also to SABAC, the Student Activities Committee. I applaud SABAC for their support and encourage them to continue to support intellectually focused events like these. They are a service to our students, they are a service to our community, and as we'll see, they're just flat out fun and delightful. I would like to introduce the topic of this evening's debate by describing first what it's not about. This is not a debate about whether or not God exists. It is not about the divinity or salvific role of Jesus Christ. It is not even specifically about the truth of Christianity as a religion. Now, to be sure, tonight's program has implications for those questions, but tonight's topic is something more technical. You might even say wonkish. It is about how we responsibly read ancient texts. It is about the criteria for reliability. And I'll repeat that. The criteria for reliability that historians place on writings that were composed a long time ago. So how do we know when we can trust something that was written that long ago? Well, girls and boys, that's a tough thing to know. And to demonstrate how tough that is to know, indulge me for a moment while I present to you the following hypothetical scenario. Imagine our world 2,000 years from now. There have been a few more world wars, environmental catastrophes, societies have collapsed, and so did much of the records of those societies. But humans, the tenacious creatures that we are, we rebuild society, and eventually some people even become interested in reconstructing the history of the ancient United States. Now, one of these historians happens to discover a collection of 10, 20, 100, no, 500 different copies of the ancient text called the National Enquirer. Now, after painstaking and rigorous examination of these tomes of wisdom, our historian concludes, quote, "You know, this Elvis guy was not nearly as dead as everybody thought he was." Now, you can sympathize with the historian's predicament. Records are few and fragmented. You don't have much to go on, and suddenly you find a whole bunch of ancient texts that all pretty much say the same thing. Is that enough to trust? Alternatively, let's take the same future scenario and another historian of ancient America who also discovers some old newspapers. Except these old newspapers say that in the early 21st century, Americans elected as their president a reality TV star with zero political experience. Now, you can see why our historian might find this claim to be dubious, and not because he dislikes reality TV, but because a reality TV star as president does not fit the pattern set by the other 44 presidents. So he concludes that perhaps this is just a tabloid. But anyway, all bad jokes aside, my point still stands. It's really, really hard to reconstruct ancient history from ancient records. Luckily, however, we have two esteemed experts with us here tonight to guide us. Therefore, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Licona. Dr. Michael Licona is Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University. He is a New Testament scholar, Christian apologist, and director of the ministry Risen Jesus. He's the author of several books, including The Resurrection of Jesus and Why There Are Differences in the Gospels. His scholarly work is noteworthy for taking historical rather than theological approaches to the questions of the resurrection and the differences among the Gospels. And if you would like to read Dr. Licona's work, there will be book sales and book signings after our program. Dr. Licona, thank you for being here. Dr. Bart Ehrman is James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Ehrman's work focuses on, among other subjects, the text and transmission of the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the history of early Christianity. He is the author or editor of over 30 books, 5 of which have been New York Times bestsellers, among them Misquoting Jesus and How Jesus Became God. In fact, Dr. Ehrman's latest book, The Triumph of Christianity, How a Forbidden Religion Swept the World, was released just about a week ago. So if you don't mind getting some wet ink on your fingers, it is available here tonight. Dr. Ehrman, welcome to Kennesaw State. Two quick things and on to the big guys. We encourage everybody here to have a blast tonight. Have fun, laugh, applaud. But we would ask you to hold your applause until after each individual speech. In other words, please don't applaud and hoot and holler during the speeches. And finally, if I can find mine, the cause of all of our joys and all of our woes, turn them off now, please. So at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Licona to deliver his 20-minute opening statement. Dr. Licona.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Kennesaw State History Club and Ratio Christi for both sponsoring and hosting this evening's debate, and thank you, Jonathan Mann, for inviting me to participate. It's good to see Bart again. Bart and I have some strong disagreements on a number of issues, and we've always had spirited debates. However, we actually get along quite well. I like Bart and certainly consider him to be a friend, even though he's wrong. Tonight's debate question is, are the Gospels historically reliable? Before we can get into this, we must first ask, what is it we mean and define by the term historically reliable? Now, many events in ancient literature cannot be verified due to a lack of data. Moreover, the meta-narrative, such as we find in the Gospels, is beyond the reach of historians. The meta-narrative is that God has sent his uniquely divine Son into the world to redeem it and has since returned to heaven, from where someday in the future he's going to come to judge the world. Now, of course, that meta-narrative is incapable of being confirmed by historians. We simply don't have the tools to verify it. Doesn't mean it's false, it just means as historians we can't verify it. So what do we mean when we ask if the Gospels are historically reliable? Well, to start, it means that the Gospels get things right. But there's more to it than that when speaking of ancient history writing, since the finest ancient historians, Greek, Roman, and Jewish alike, were committed to accurate reporting and to writing good literature for the reader's benefit. And that often meant reporting in a manner that was less concerned with precision than modern historians have. Think about it this way. How many of you are married? Quite a few of you. Well, you know, of course, what I mean then when I say there's the guy version of the story and the girl version. Now, I'm overgeneralizing here, but for the most part, women like details, and lots of them. They want to know what happened, where it happened, when it happened, why it happened, who was there, what they were saying, what they were wearing, what they were thinking, how they were feeling, and then they want to know how you feel about it. Now, guys are different. We like bullet points. Get to the bottom line. When we tell a story to someone who, we're relating that particular story, we may abbreviate the story, we may adapt it some and change some of the details a little. We're not trying to corrupt or pervert the truth. On the contrary, knowing what that other person is looking for, we're trying to communicate the truth with more clarity. Now, let me give you a couple of more examples. The first book written by my late friend Nabil Qureshi was a New York Times bestseller, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. It's an autobiography of Nabil's journey from Islam to Christianity. Bart may remember Nabil from a few years back when he was a student at Duke. Here's what Nabil wrote in the introduction to his biography. By its very nature, a narrative biography must take certain liberties with the story it shares. Please do not expect camera-like accuracy. This is not the intent of this book. And to meet such a standard, it would have to be a 22-year-long video, most of which would bore even my mother to tears. The words I have in quotations are rough approximations. A few of the conversations represent multiple meetings condensed into one. In some instances, stories are displaced in the timeline to fit the topical categorization. In other instances, people who were present in the conversation were left out of the narrative for the sake of clarity. All of these devices are normal for narrative biographies. Please read accordingly. Now, that's biography written in modern times by a meticulous academic. Now let's go to antiquity. A man named Sallust commanded one of Caesar's legions and would become one of Rome's finest historians. Tacitus referred to Sallust as, quote, that most admirable Roman historian. The famous rhetorician Quintilian said Sallust was a greater historian than Livy, and that, quote, one needs to be well advanced in one's studies in order to appreciate him properly. So it's noteworthy that Sallust occasionally displaced statements and speeches from their original context and transplanted them in a different one in order to highlight the true intensity and even the true nature of those events. The finest ancient historians commonly used that technique called displacement and others. Now, in my view, that does not undermine the overall reliability of the literature, as long as we have the understanding that what we are reading was intended to communicate an accurate gist, or an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. Ancient historical literature rarely ever intended to describe events with the precision of a legal transcript. In other words, it's often the guy version of the story with a lot more class. So here's the bottom line. Historians can speak of historical reliability in terms of specific stories and even in the broader sense of the entire biography. And it's this broader sense in which I'm interested this evening. So in what follows, I'll offer 6 criteria of reliability that provide confidence in the historical reliability of the Gospels in a general or broad sense. The first criterion is the author intended to write an accurate account. The majority of New Testament scholars now hold that the Gospels share much in common with the genre of ancient biography. From the Renaissance period to the present, much of our understanding of the ancient world derives from the biographies written by Plutarch. Now, of course, that's the real Plutarch and not the Plutarch in The Hunger Games. Ronald Meller of UCLA refers to Plutarch as, quote, the greatest of all ancient biographers. Plutarch told his readers that the biographies he was writing of people who had lived 800 to 1,000 years before his own time are not historically reliable because he had lacked good sources on which to rely. So he had to employ a lot of guesswork. Plutarch contrasts these biographies with those he had written of people who had lived within only 150 years of his own time. He says those biographies relied on better sources and could be trusted. Now, the Gospels were written within only 35 to 65 years of Jesus, and perhaps even earlier. When they were written, eyewitnesses of Jesus and those who had known them were still alive. So there was no need for the Gospel authors to employ the large scale of conjecturing present in Plutarch's biographies of much earlier times. Furthermore, the Gospels do not hesitate to report embarrassing details, such as Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him during his ministry and that he wasn't aware of the time when he would return to judge the world, and others. Now, although their embarrassing nature is not so evident to modern readers, they would have been to the early Christians. Yet the Gospel authors chose not to omit them, suggesting their intent was to present accurate accounts of Jesus. The second criterion is the author used good judgment in his choice of sources. At least half of today's critical New Testament scholars agree with the early church tradition that Mark's primary source was Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. A majority of critical scholars agree that the primary sources for the Gospel of Luke and its sequel, the book of Acts, included Mark's Gospel, people more directly acquainted with Jesus, an early source scholars call Q, short for the German word Quelle, meaning source, and Paul, with whom many believe he had traveled. A majority of critical scholars also agree that John's Gospel was written either by an eyewitness or that an eyewitness was the author's primary source for much of the information in that Gospel. So contrary to what the old form critics claimed, the Gospels are not a compilation of stories known by the Gospel authors only after those stories had been passed around carelessly, word of mouth, by a vast number of unknown individuals over the course of 4 decades or even longer. For at minimum, the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and John are based on excellent sources who were either eyewitnesses or those not far removed from them. The third criterion is the author used good judgment in his use of those sources. Classicists believe Plutarch used only Dionysius of Halicarnassus as the source for his biography of the Roman general Coriolanus. So by comparing Plutarch's version with that of Coriolanus, we can decrypt what Plutarch did with his source when writing his biography of Coriolanus. We can do something similar with some of the Gospels. A near consensus of New Testament scholars hold that Mark was the first gospel to have been written, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their primary source. So by carefully comparing how Matthew and Luke used Mark, we can decrypt what they did and were willing to do with their source. Sometimes they use Mark verbatim, sometimes they paraphrase him, sometimes they adapt him. But when one also considers other historians and biographers who wrote around the same time as the Gospels and compares how they used their sources, one is struck far more by the similarities between the Gospels than by their differences. For when Matthew and Luke use Mark as their source, they stay far more closely to their source than most other historians and biographers do with their sources. The fourth criterion is the author and his sources were capable of reporting accurately. A few years ago, my wife Debbie and I viewed the series Vietnam in HD. Those of you who saw the movie We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson and Sam Elliott, will recall there was a combat reporter named Joe Galloway who was with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and his soldiers during the 3-day Battle of Yadrang River Valley in November 1965. In the first episode of Vietnam in HD, the real Galloway teared up in an interview while talking about his experience during those days of battle, obviously still impacted by them even after 35 years. Then there was a 60-second clip of Galloway I thought quite profound. Here's what he said. "I left that landing zone X-ray battlefield knowing that young Americans had laid down their lives so that I might live. They had sacrificed themselves for me and their buddies. What I was learning was that there's some events that are so overwhelming that you can't simply be a witness. You can't be above it. You can't be neutral. You can't be untouched by it. Simple as that. You see it, you live it, you experience it, and it will be with you all of your days." Now ask yourself, if Jesus actually performed the events that are reported in the Gospels and you had been there, you saw him give sight to the blind, you saw him give hearing to a deaf person, you saw him take a paralyzed man, heal him so that he could walk again. You saw Jesus walk on water and raise the dead. And then you saw him crucified. And then shortly after, you saw him alive and in perfect health. Do you think that if you had experienced, had witnessed that would have left an impact on you that was as deep and lasting as those 3 days of battle had on Joe Galloway? Well, that's Jesus' deeds. What about his teachings? Now, unlike modern pastors who have to prepare a new sermon every week, Jesus was an itinerant preacher. And so he was traveling and speaking to new audiences all the time. So perhaps he had a dozen or so sermons, and he preached these same sermons over and 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 over. And then he told his disciples who had heard him preach this, he said, "Now I want you guys to go out and preach the same things. And I send you out by twos." They could go out, they could correct one another. And so they went out and they taught the same things they had heard countless times. They taught it over and 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 over. And then they returned and Jesus debriefed them. And then he showed them how to adapt some of those teachings. Hey, when you're speaking to a Gentile audience, you can tweak this parable a little bit from what you do with a Jewish audience, and so forth. And so he illustrated this, and he showed them again the same teachings over and 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 over. And then, of course, he's crucified, rises from the dead, commissions his disciples to go out and make disciples of all nations, and now, for the next several decades, they preach the same things over and over, and you get the idea, right? Perhaps thousands of times. So Jesus' messages, his teachings, weren't something that he spoke of just once and then his disciples had to recall decades later. And like any good teacher, Jesus taught in a way, he formulated these to make them memorable. So he taught in parables. He used rhetoric such as hyperbolic language to shock his listeners. Unless you hate all your family members, you can't be my disciple. If your right eye makes you sin, rip it out and throw it from you. We don't forget these things. Parable of the prodigal son, who forgets that, right? So the essence of Jesus' deeds and teachings could quite easily have been recalled accurately even decades later. The fifth criterion is we can verify numerous items reported. Many items in the Gospels reflect existing knowledge pertaining to the historical setting in which the Gospels are situated. Richard Bauckham has shown that when ancient documents and inscriptions are considered, the names mentioned in the Gospels and the book of Acts are not only common names of Palestinian Jews of that period and not those of Jews elsewhere, they also appear with roughly the same frequency in the Gospels and the book of Acts that we find in extra-biblical sources. At the very minimum, this suggests all of the gospel authors, or the sources from which they drew, were acquainted with Palestine around the time of Jesus. We also know that places mentioned in the Gospels actually existed. For example, Capernaum, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Bethsaida, Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives. We know that several of the people mentioned in the Gospels actually existed during the period in which they're situated. Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, Quirinius, the Herods, Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, Jesus, John the Baptist, James, the brother of Jesus. A number of items about Jesus reported in the Gospels are corroborated by non-Christian, unsympathetic sources, such as Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and Bar Serapion. Most historians of Jesus employ a number of the criteria of authenticity. Is the item reported by an early source, by an eyewitness, by an unsympathetic source, by multiple independent sources? When these criteria and others are employed in reference to traditions about Jesus in the Gospels, there are numerous items about Jesus that nearly all scholars regard as being virtually certain. And finally, number 6, no more than a very small percentage of items reported by an ancient author are known to be false. When we bracket theological claims in the Gospels, since they are outside the reach of historians, there are only a few historical items in the Gospels that are reasonably good candidates for being incorrect. For example, Luke's report of Augustus' census when Quirinius was governor of Syria, the different genealogies in Matthew and Luke, and the chronologies in their infancy narratives. 3 instances where the name of a person in the Old Testament is stated differently in the Gospels. A few occasions where Mark may be geographically confused. References to Christians being banished from the synagogue at a premature date in John. A few minor chronological items in the Passion narratives in Mark and John, and the manner in which Judas died in Matthew and the book of Acts. Now, reasonable alternatives to error have been posited for many of these. However, even if we were to judge that every last one of them are outright errors, they are minor matters and make up only a very, very small percentage of the content in our 4 Gospels. Okay, I'll summarize and conclude. I'm proposing that we must think of historical reliability in view of the literary conventions in play at the time of writing. To say that a particular historical work in antiquity is historically reliable does not require reports to have accuracy with the precision of a legal transcript, or that it be free of all error or any embellishment. Historically reliable means, at the very minimum, the account provides an accurate gist or an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. Think of Nabil's book and the Guy version of a story. We've seen that we have good arguments or good grounds for believing the Gospels are historically reliable in this sense because they meet this minimum standard. In fact, I think they go well beyond the minimum.
Well, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, Brian, Jonathan, and others. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. I'd like to thank Mike. We've debated, what, 3 times? 4 times?
No, we include podcasts and stuff.
Yeah, okay, include podcasts. It's like been a multitude. So my favorite debate with Mike was, I think it was our second one. He had laryngitis. He literally couldn't speak. I destroyed him. He couldn't answer a single one of my arguments. All right, how many of you are students here? Good, okay. How many of you here consider yourselves to be Bible-believing Christians? Wow, okay, huh. How many of you are here to see me get creamed? Yeah, okay. Right. I saw Mike raise his hand just then. Okay, well, look, it's a pleasure to be with you, and this is a really important topic. I've thought this was an important topic since I was 15 years old. So that's 47 years I've thought about this topic. When I started out thinking seriously about the Bible, I was a Bible-believing Christian. I was a conservative evangelical. I was firmly committed to the idea that the Bible has no mistakes of any kind whatsoever. But I got to a point in my thinking where I thought, if the Bible has no mistakes, there won't be mistakes. Are there mistakes? I opened my mind to just exploring it, not because I thought there were mistakes, but because I thought, well, if there aren't mistakes, I won't find mistakes. And I started looking. This was a process that took several years before I finally could bring myself to admit that I found something that I thought was a mistake. And then I started finding more and more and more. It ended up seriously affecting my faith. But I'm really glad that I did it, because I think it's more important to believe what is true than to believe what you've been taught or what you've heard or what you want to believe. It's more important to follow the truth. In this debate, we're not really debating whether the Gospels of the New Testament were reliable by ancient standards. We're not asking how they compare to ancient historians, how they stack up against Plutarch or against Livy or against other authors from the ancient world. We're debating, are the Gospels historically reliable? I'm taking that question to mean something pretty basic. Do the Gospels describe what actually happened in the past accurately? If you read a book today, if you read a biography, you read a history, suppose you read a study of Abraham Lincoln or Marco Polo or Julius Caesar, and you ask yourself, is it accurate? What you mean is, you're not asking, is it accurate in comparison, like is it about as badly accurate as some other book written at the same time? You're asking, is it accurate? Does it describe the things that this person said and did, or are there mistakes in it? You're asking, with respect to the Gospels, do they actually describe what Jesus said and did? On this topic, there are some points on which Mike and I are certainly going to agree. We agree that the Gospel writers were first century authors who were writing according to the conventions and style of their day, and that they had limitations that were imposed upon them by their day. We agree on that. We agree that there's some material in the Gospels that is certainly historically reliable. There really was a Jesus. He was probably baptized by John the Baptist. He had 12 followers. He taught about the coming kingdom of God. He told parables. He had a trip to Jerusalem. He was arrested and put on trial and executed. And in broad terms, very, very broad terms, I agree that the Gospels are giving us some reliable information. But I don't think that the Gospels are accurate in many of the things that they say that Jesus taught and did. And I'm going to try and demonstrate it to you. I don't have much time. I've got basically 15 minutes to try to do this, and it takes years, really, to see it. But I want you at least to listen to the evidence that I cite and think about it. I'm going to take 3 periods of Jesus' life, the very beginning, the accounts of his birth, something about his ministry, and then the accounts of his death and resurrection. So we start with his birth. The birth of Jesus is narrated in 2 of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Nothing about his birth in the Gospel of Mark or in the Gospel of John. I'm going to focus first on the Gospel of Luke. Luke knows that Jesus was raised in the town of Nazareth, which is up in Galilee, the northern part of Israel, but he thinks that Jesus got born in Bethlehem, which of course is what most people think because they've read the Gospel of Luke. Jesus gets born in Bethlehem. The question is, if his parents were from Nazareth, how did he get born in Bethlehem? Well, Luke tells us how. This is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 1. You can read this for yourself. In those days, the decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. Okay, well, nobody thinks that the entire world is being enrolled for a census. People off in China were not subservient to Caesar Augustus, so let's just say the Roman Empire. Everybody has to enroll for the census. What's that got to do with Jesus being born in Bethlehem? Well, his parents, Joseph and Mary, Joseph's not really his parent, but Joseph is from the lineage of King David, we're told. He's from the house and lineage of David. And David came from Bethlehem. And to register for the census, everybody has to go to their home of their ancestry. And since he's from David's family, David was from Bethlehem, he's got to go to Bethlehem. So they go to Bethlehem. And while they're there, Mary goes into labor and she gives birth in Bethlehem. We're told this happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. This is a hugely problematic passage, as Mike knows very well. What does it mean that Joseph went to the home of David? David was the king of Israel who lived 1,000 years before Joseph. Do you mean everybody in the Roman Empire is returning to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier to register for a census? Whoa, how's that supposed to work? Suppose that the Democrats win this next election and they impose more taxes on us, which is likely, and when they do that, we have to register for a tax by going to our ancestral home. You have to go to the ancestral home where your ancestor came from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go? And the entire country does this, and it's not mentioned in the newspapers. There is no reference to this census in any ancient source, period, apart from Luke and Christian authors who've read Luke. Why no reference to it, even though the reign of Caesar Augustus is well documented? Because it didn't happen. There was no census of the entire world where everybody had to register at their ancestral home. It didn't happen. Well, why does Luke say it happened? For a very simple reason. He knew that Jesus came from Nazareth, but he had to have him born in Bethlehem because that's where David was born. The Savior has to come. The Savior is the son of David, has to come from Bethlehem. The census didn't happen. Moreover, Luke says it happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Mike himself just told us, I'm not sure if you caught this part, Quirinius was the governor of Syria starting in the year 6 of the Common Era. King Herod died in the year 4 BCE. If Jesus was born under the reign of King Herod, he could not have been, the census could not have happened under Quirinius. There's a 10-year gap. Luke goes on to describe what happens after Jesus' birth. Mary goes into labor, she gives birth. We're told that Jesus was circumcised 8 days later, and then it came time for her purification, according to the law of Moses. This is a reference to a passage in Leviticus chapter 12. In Leviticus chapter 12, we're told that 32 days after a woman gives birth, she's supposed to perform a sacrifice for ritual purity. And so she performs the sacrifice, 2 turtle doves in the temple, and then we're told they went back to Nazareth. Okay, so they're just in town for a month. That's fine. But what do you do about what is said in the Gospel of Matthew about Jesus' birth? In Matthew, what happens is Jesus is born in Bethlehem. These wise men come to worship him. King Herod finds out that the king of the Jews has been born in Bethlehem, and he sends out the troops in order to kill the child. The troops kill every boy 2 years and under. Joseph learns in a dream that the slaughter is coming, and he's told to go to Egypt. He and Mary and Jesus they flee to Egypt. And they stay there until King Herod dies, and then they come back and relocate to Nazareth. If Matthew's right that they fled to Egypt, how can Luke be right that they went back to Nazareth a month later? The chronology doesn't work. That's the birth of Jesus. We could say a lot more about the birth of Jesus, but I want to move on to his ministry. So, the ministry of Jesus. Of course, most of the Gospels deal with the ministry of Jesus. Mark begins with the ministry of Jesus, begins with Jesus' baptism. Matthew and Luke, most of them about the ministry. The Gospel of John, most of them about the ministry. There are a lot of things we could talk about the ministry. I just want to talk about one aspect, and it happens to be something that Mike brought up, the words of Jesus. Do we know what Jesus actually said? The most famous part of Jesus' teaching is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. It is 3 chapters of Jesus talking. 3 chapters. Matthew's gospel was probably written in the 80s of the Common Era. That is, it sounds like that's the dating that Mike is going with when he said the Gospels were written between 40 and 65 years later. So probably 50, 55 years later is when Matthew's written. Matthew's writing a sermon that Jesus gave on this mount. He's writing this account 50 years after the sermon was given. How well can you remember Barack Obama's last State of the Union address from 2 years ago? Could you write it down? 2 years ago? What if you waited 50 years? Could you write word for word what Barack Obama said in his speech? You were probably paying attention. I was paying attention, and I don't even know what he was talking about. The Gospel of John has a speech of Jesus that begins in chapter 13. He's giving it to his disciples, his last evening with them. Chapter 13, the speech goes into chapter 14, all of 14, goes through into all of chapter 15, and then all of chapter 16. And in chapter 17, he leaps into a prayer that goes all of chapter 17. It's 5 chapters, written 65 years later. What is the likelihood that we know what Jesus said on this occasion? Now, Mike has just told us that the way the gospel writers knew what was said is because Jesus said these things over and over and over and over. I'm not going to say how many overs that is because I don't have enough time, but that over and over again. You will notice that he never pointed out whether that is ever said in the New Testament. Where in the New Testament does it ever say that Jesus gave the same sermon over and over and over and over and over and over again? It doesn't say anywhere. Where does he give the same speech over and over again in the New Testament? He never gives the same speech more than once in the New Testament. So why does Mike think that he did? Because Mike thinks he did. That's just like, well, that makes sense. So that must have been how it happened. But what's the evidence? Historians prefer evidence, and I don't know of any. There's certainly no evidence that he gave the Sermon on the Mount over and over and over and over again. It's given as a one-time speech. And he certainly didn't give his farewell discourse to his disciples over and over again. It was the last thing he said to them the night he was arrested and then sent to jail. Let me move to the end of Jesus' life, his death and resurrection. It is interesting that both the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John tell you exactly the day on which Jesus died. It was sometime around the Passover feast when Jews would celebrate the Passover, the Exodus from Egypt, by having a lamb slaughtered in the temple on the day of preparation for the Passover. You prepare the Passover meal, which involves eating lamb that night. The lambs get slaughtered on the day of preparation, and that night is when the next day begins in Jewish reckoning. The next night, the night's the next day. When it gets dark, that's when the day begins in Jewish reckoning. So in all the Gospels, Jesus dies sometime around there somewhere. In John's Gospel, John is clear. Jesus dies on the day that they are preparing to eat the Passover, the day before the Passover meal is eaten. Mark's Gospel is also explicit. Jesus dies the day after the Passover meal is eaten. You don't need to take my word for it. Look it up. Mark chapter 14, verse 12, and then Mark chapter 15, verse 25. It's the day after the meal was eaten. John chapter 19, verse 14, it was the day before the meal was eaten. They're explicit, both of them. But how can it be both? Now you might say, look, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean, he died sometime around there, fine. Okay, but it actually matters to John and it matters to Mark. It matters to John because John is our only gospel that says that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. John is the only gospel that says that, and he has Jesus killed exactly when the lambs are being killed to show that he's the Lamb of God. It matters to him when Jesus died. And it matters for Mark that Jesus died the next day, because for Mark, when Jesus gives his Last Supper, it's a Passover meal. So that the Christian, the Lord's Supper, is a replacement of the Passover meal. It's important to both of them when Jesus died, but he dies on different days. They can't both be right. If you're asking, are the Gospels accurate? Well, one or both of them had to get it wrong because Jesus didn't get crucified 2 different times. He got crucified once. There are a number of implausible things that you find in the gospel accounts of Jesus' death. The most famous one is in the Gospel of Matthew. It's when Jesus is being crucified. We're told in Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 and following, that when Jesus was crucified, the curtain in the temple was torn in two, the earth shook, so there's this earthquake, the rocks were split. I've never known what that means, but the rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. These are the zombies of Matthew, the walking dead. Really? I think Mike's going to agree with me on this one. This did not happen. Are the Gospels accurate? Matthew says it happened. I don't think it happened. There are other problems with the Passion narratives. Let me just give you one more in my conclusion, having to do with the resurrection narratives. Here's an exercise for you. You don't need to trust Mike when he says, that you can trust the Gospels. You can just read them yourself. And I'll tell you how to read them to see if they're accurate. Read one account of the resurrection, read Matthew's account, then list everything that happens. Read Mark and list everything, then Luke, list everything, John, list everything that happens, and compare your lists. Do it yourself. Think for yourself and figure it out. Are they accurate or not? Not if they contradict each other. In Matthew's account, when Jesus is raised from the dead, the women go to the tomb and they're told to go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. They are to tell the disciples to go to Galilee and meet Jesus there. The women go tell the disciples, and the disciples go to Galilee and they meet Jesus there. And that's where Jesus gives his final instructions, and the gospel ends. In the Gospel of Luke, the women are not told to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. They're told to tell the disciples what Jesus told them when he was in Galilee, that he'd be raised. And Jesus then appears to the disciples and he tells them, do not leave the city Jerusalem. And they don't leave the city of Jerusalem. They see Jesus in Jerusalem, and he says, stay there until the power comes upon you from on high. In other words, when the Holy Spirit comes upon them. That's what's going to happen on the day of Pentecost 50 days later. And they don't leave the city. They're still in Jerusalem, in Judea, until the day of Pentecost, 50 days later, after Jesus has ascended to heaven. Well, if Luke is right that they stayed in Jerusalem, how can Matthew be right that they went to Galilee? They can't both be right. The Gospels can be shown to have contradictions and discrepancies and historical errors and mistakes. They do have. I'm not arguing that they are religiously insignificant, or that they shouldn't be read for theological reasons, or that they should not be your books of faith. I'm arguing that they're not historically accurate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bart. In my opening statement, I contended that we must assess historical literature in view of the literary conventions in play at the time of writing. In relation to ancient historical literature, I defined historically reliable as providing an accurate gist, or an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. I then offered 6 criteria by which we may assess ancient historical literature, and contended the Gospels meet all 6. Therefore, the Gospels are historically reliable. I'd like now to review those 6 criteria in light of Bart's comments. The first criterion is the author intended to write an accurate account. And here I contended that the Gospels were written so close to the events that large-scale conjecturing by their authors was not required. Moreover, the Gospel authors chose not to omit embarrassing details which suggest that they intended to write accurate accounts. Now, Bart responded that, well, we're really not talking about accuracy or reliability by ancient standards, we're talking by modern standards. Well, no, I'm talking about ancient standards, and here's why. Let's say 200 years from now, our standards for writing history change. As one of my students said today in a class, he said, what if, in the future, 200 years from now, we've got software, video that can assess what a person is, their facial expressions, and can tell what they're actually feeling and thinking at that time, stuff, of course, that we don't have today. Well, they might look and say, well, those people back in the early 21st century, they didn't write anything that was historically reliable. Well, of course, the standards 200 years from now may be different than they are right now. But we would expect them to extend some charity to us because we were operating by our present standards. Our objectives are a little bit different. And in the same way, I think the ancients would appreciate if we extended some charity to them as well. In fact, modern biography as we know it today is only about 200 years old. Moreover, let me try to give you a little word picture of the different kinds of objectives and how they work. Modern English translations, we've got plenty of them, English translations of the Bible, but they can be summarized in a number of different categories. Like, for example, we have literal translations like the New American Standard Bible that would, as best as possible, they try to translate the Greek and Hebrew text into English as close as possible, literally, as what the Greek and English texts say. Then there are dynamic translations like the New International Version that are willing to sacrifice some degree of precision in order for clarity and for readability. And then, of course, there are paraphrases, which there's no attempt whatsoever to get precision in terms of what the word-for-word text said. Instead, the priority is readability and bringing out the gist, the essential faithful representation of what the Greek and Hebrew texts say behind them. Now, those are different objectives in those translations, and it would be wrong for us to say that a paraphrase or the NIV is unreliable because it doesn't meet those standards for a literal translation when that is not the objective behind it. The ancients were trying to give us an accurate literary portrait of what that individual was. And sometimes they had to squeeze a lifetime, like remember what Nabil said, all these years down into something that could be read in a scroll in a 3-hour period. So it's not going to be accurate in a precise sense, but the best ancient historians did it in a way where it was accurate in terms of the portrait. Now, The second criterion is the author used good judgment in his choice of sources. And here I argued that at least half to the majority of critical scholars think Mark, Luke, and John were authored either by an eyewitness or by someone not far removed from the eyewitnesses. That went unchallenged. The third criterion is the author used good judgment in his use of those sources, and I contended that Matthew and Luke stick closely to Mark, more closely than virtually all other biographers of that period stick with their sources. That went unchallenged. The fourth criterion is that the authors and their sources were capable of reporting accurate history. And here I contended that the miraculous nature of Jesus' deeds and both the repetition and rhetoric of his teachings made it quite easy to recall them accurately decades later. Now, Bart did respond here. He brought up the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' speech, high priestly prayer and speech in the Gospel of John. And he said, well, think about Barack Obama's presidential address. Do you remember that? Well, no. I only heard it once, and it was years ago. But again, that's different than Jesus' disciples who would have heard Jesus teach the same things over and over and over, and then they taught it over and over and over, and then Jesus went, and you know how it all goes. Well, Bart says, where does it say that Jesus said this over and over and over? Well, I agree, the Gospels don't say that, but I do think it's a fair inference. That would be the standard practice back then of what a teacher did with his disciples. Moreover, how often do the disciples or the Gospels mention Jesus eating? I think we can assume that he ate a whole lot more frequently than the Gospels mention. So the standard practice would have been for him to teach these same things over and over rather than come up with a new sermon for every village, town, and city. And I think because that would have been the standard practice, the burden of proof rests on Bart if he wants to argue otherwise. Now, in terms of the Sermon on the Mount, there's no question this is not a transcript of Jesus' teachings of what he said on that particular occasion. I don't know of any New Testament scholars, even evangelical New Testament scholars, who would say that Matthew is a transcript of everything Jesus said on that occasion. But they would agree, I think, to the last one of them, that what Matthew has done is he has taken a core of some teachings that Jesus gave on that occasion, probably some of what we see in the Gospel of Luke, and then he has called a bunch of teachings that Jesus made over his ministry, and he's artistically combined them together in the Sermon on the Mount that we find in the Gospel of Matthew. Same thing would happen with the Gospel of John, that a lot of Jesus' teachings would have been put in that, and that wouldn't have been necessarily everything that he would have said on that occasion. This would have been standard practice for writing ancient biography and history because they didn't have camcorders, they didn't have audio recorders. Shorthand was in its infancy stages of development. This is the kind of way that history was reported. It is not to say that Matthew and John were inventing these teachings of Jesus. By no means. These would have been things that Jesus would have taught, but not necessarily all of them on that particular occasion. Number 5, we can verify numerous elements reported by the ancient author. Here I contended that many items in the Gospels can be verified, such as names, places, people, and many of Jesus' teachings and deeds, and this went uncontested. Finally, number 6, no more than a very small percentage of items reported by the ancient author are false, or known to be false. Here I listed more than a dozen items that are reasonably good candidates for being errors, yet I said that all of them are in minor details and don't undermine the overall reliability of the accounts. And I don't think that what Bart said challenged that. All he did was add some more to the list, or even just expounded on some of the ones that I gave. For example, the infancy narratives. He says that the sensitive is not mentioned anywhere else. Well, guess what? Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome, which is mentioned in the book of Acts. The only other place it's mentioned is in Suetonius's life of Claudius Caesar in chapter 26. If it had not been for 2 sentences in Suetonius, that would have been Luke would have been the only person mentioning it. And so just because it's singly attested doesn't mean that it didn't happen. In terms of Quirinius, I admit, this is problematic. It is one of those items in the Gospels that are potential errors. However, numerous alternatives to error have been proposed, and the matter is far from settled. Bart mentioned the death of Jesus, that John changes the day. I agree with him on this. I think John does change the day and the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He places it the day of the Passover meal, whereas the synoptics have it the day after the Passover meal. And John does this for theological reasons, to highlight that Jesus is the Lamb of God, something which Paul had already mentioned in his letters decades earlier. So it's not like he's inventing the theology. Nobody, not even Bart, is going to dispute that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate and died as a result. It's just a matter of how John has done these things. And guess what? It's no different than what other of the most well-respected Roman historians did. For example, Tacitus moves the suicide of Piso months back in order to add to the drama of it. And Tacitus is considered to be the most accurate and greatest of the Roman historians. Sallust, another one of the most respected historians, talks about, he takes the speech of Catiline and moves it back months in one case and moves it forward in another, a different one forward in another case, in order to highlight the intensity and the nature of what was going on. But the speech actually happened, he just puts it at a different time. This is something, again, that would have been allowable in ancient history and biography. Bart mentions the saints raised at Jesus' death. I agree with him here. I think if we had a video camera and we're back there, I don't think we would have witnessed it. But as I've written and have in print elsewhere, I think that based on the Jewish literature and the Greco-Roman literature in the period, that Matthew is doing no differently than the Jewish and Greco-Roman authors here, and he's just basically using special effects, a literary device to highlight the importance of the death that had taken place. Jesus, the Son of God, had died. Now, to say that Matthew is just, this is a false story in there, I think is a miscategorization. It'd be like 200 years from now if a historian says, hey, I read that about 9/11 and some of the eyewitnesses said 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. Well, I looked through all the seismographs and I didn't notice any kind of earthquakes happening that day, so it must be historically unreliable. We'd say, no, you're missing the whole point. It's a linguistic idiom that was part of that culture. I think that's exactly what Matthew is doing here. All right, so I got to wrap up. More on contradictions. Look, I've written a book on it. It was published last year by Oxford University Press. I spent 8 years looking at ancient literature, compositional devices. I wrote a book trying to answer the question, why are there differences in the Gospels? The title of the book is, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? One final thing is, if Bart thinks that something is historically unreliable because it contradicts itself, I'd say he needs to look out, because he contradicts himself. In a debate, one of our debates, when I cited a number of scholars, he replied and he said, you can't just cite scholars, because scholars aren't evidence, they're just opinions. And then he goes on, and on another occasion, he cites scholars in support of his view to say that I'm wrong on some things. So, which one is it? Well, it depends which Bart you're listening to. So, if you're going to contradict yourself, I guess at that point, then you just discredited yourself. So Bart's challenges, I think, to the reliability of the Gospels fail, and we've already seen that there are good reasons to believe the Gospels are historically reliable.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's a little bit unusual for me to be debating somebody who's agreeing with me. And I don't know if you all were picking up on this, but Mike is agreeing that the Gospels are not accurate by modern standards. He's agreeing that, that there are contradictions in the Bible, in the Gospels. He's agreeing that there are errors in the Gospels. He concedes the point. Now, he thinks that they're generally reliable and that the gist is reliable. We can debate about that, but I want you to understand what he's arguing. He agrees that there are mistakes in the Gospels. He thinks that they're minor ones. He picks 12 of them, and maybe 12 is a small number. My question at the end of this is going to be, if we know that the Gospels are wrong in some small things, how do we know that they're not wrong in big things? Well, that's an interesting question. It's true. These were people who were writing following ancient standards of historiography. They were following ancient standards. What else could they do? They were ancients. But most of us, when we want to know, are the Gospels reliable, we're not asking the question that academic pinheads like Mike and I are interested in. We academic pinheads are interested in things like, how does Luke stack up against Plutarch? How many of you have stayed up at night wondering how Plutarch stacks up against Luke? It's not something we worry about. If you want to know if the Gospels are reliable, look, you read the Bible, you want to know, did it happen this way? Did Jesus say this? Did he do this? Or not? For me, it's interesting. It's what I do for a living to figure out how close it is to Plutarch. But it's not really the question we're debating here. We want to know whether the Gospels record what Jesus said and did accurately. Suppose you find an ancient map, and you want to know, is this map accurate? Well, you wouldn't ask, did it follow ancient methods of following maps so that its mistakes can be explained? And so, by ancient standards, it's not bad. If you ask, is this map accurate? You're asking, if I want to go from point A to point B, will this map tell me how to do it or not? You want to know if it is accurate. Not whether the person was limited in his abilities to write a map, but whether it's accurate or not. We're asking, are the Gospels accurate or not? I continue to be a little bit surprised that Mike doesn't look at the actual evidence of the Gospels. He said that, I didn't refute his six points. One reason I didn't refute his 6 points is because I didn't know what his 6 points were going to be, and I was giving my own speech. The reason I didn't actually refute his points is because they strike me as being kind of general statements that don't have he didn't cite any evidence for them. Did the Gospels intend to write accurately or not? Did they use good sources? Did they use good judgment? He says yes. Okay, but what am I going to argue? What I want to talk about is the evidence. And I would like you to consider actually looking at the evidence yourself to decide where does the evidence take you. Let me point out some more evidence. Here's an interesting exercise for you to do sometime. There are 2 genealogies of Jesus in the New Testament. Genealogies that trace his bloodline. They're both interesting. One's in Matthew and one's in Luke. Matthew's is in chapter 1, Luke's is in chapter 3. They've got some major differences between them. Matthew's genealogy traces his line back to Abraham, the father of the Jews. Luke's genealogy traces him back to Adam. That's a genealogy. I've got an aunt who's a genealogist who traced my family line back to the Mayflower. The Mayflower, Adam and Eve, that's a genealogy. You get these 2 genealogies. Look at them yourself and ask, who is Joseph's father? Who's Joseph's grandfather? Who's his great-grandfather? Who's his great-great-grandfather? They are different genealogies, and they are both explicitly genealogies of Joseph. Now, it might seem a little bit weird that they're giving genealogies of Joseph in the first place, because Jesus is not related to Joseph. But they give the genealogies of Joseph, and they're different genealogies. How could that be? Well, because they both can't be right. Or take another thing, at the end of Jesus' life, Peter's denials of Jesus. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Does he deny him 3 times before the cock crows at all, or before the cock crows twice? And if you look at the denials, he denies him to different people in different Gospels. The way some fundamentalists reconcile this is by saying that Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed, and 3 times before it crowed twice, so that Peter denied Jesus 6 times. Well, that's clever, and it's precisely what none of the Gospels say. Now, Mike doesn't do that. He agrees. This is a contradiction. But here we go, another contradiction. We could go all night talking about the contradictions. And Mike's going to agree with most of the things I say, and then he's going to come out and say, and the Gospels are historically reliable. And I don't quite understand that. If there are mistakes, there are mistakes. If there are stories of zombies that didn't happen, then it didn't happen. How is it accurate if it didn't happen? Right, my point 4. Mike had one very interesting point that I wanted to talk about for a second, because it was the first time that he actually got to evidence from the Gospels in his point 5. I don't know if you're all taking notes. It doesn't look like you are, but his point 5 was that you can verify names in the Gospels and places in the Gospels. The Gospels mention places that actually exist. Therefore, they're reliable. They name people. They give names, like the name James and the name John. And, these are names that like occur at the time, so they're accurate. And, I just don't see how that makes the Gospels accurate. So I teach in Chapel Hill. Suppose in 2,000 years, there's a story floating around that on February 21st in 2018, Professor Ehrman was going from his office in Carolina Hall to his classroom in Murphy Hall, where he was teaching a class on the historical Jesus. And before he got to that building, it was blown up by a bomb placed by some student who didn't want to take his midterm, or something like that. All right, so in 2,000 years, an archaeologist comes around and he digs up. There is a place like Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, it's a place. And they find the records, and there is a Professor Ehrman who was teaching there. It's accurate. And he was in Carolina Hall. That's where he taught. And they find the records that, yes, he taught a class in Murphy Hall that day. That story is historically accurate because the names and the places fit. No, it's not accurate. There was no bomb that went off this morning to blow up the building because of a disgruntled student. The story isn't accurate. And so what good does it do to tell you that, yes, there really was a place named Nazareth? There really was a place named Bethlehem. Yes, Joseph is a common name. Mary is a common name. Well, that's nice, but it doesn't tell you if the stories are accurate. To know if the stories are accurate, you have to look at them. You have to engage in a study of them to see whether they're accurate. If you have two stories that tell the same story and they're at odds with each other, they both obviously can't be right. Mike mentioned a book that he wrote, and I read it this weekend. So congratulations. Oxford University Press. It's a significant study of Plutarch and the Gospels. Plutarch was one of the most highly educated men of his era. He was one of the very upper crust literary elite. The Gospel writers, frankly, were not. They were not on his level. But they did write biographies, and he wrote biographies. And Mike tells us that in Plutarch's biographies, this is the best biographer of his day, as he just told us, I'm quoting him, Mike, there are factual errors. He has a faulty memory. He bends the facts. He has no commitment to present the facts with legal precision. He takes liberties with his sources. He mixes history and conjecture. He sacrifices historical truth. That's the best biographer. And the Gospels are not on his level. How can we possibly say that they're historically accurate? Here's the big deal. It is really, if you just look at the Gospels carefully, if you just read them carefully, by reading the story in one Gospel with the story of another Gospel and comparing them, you can see that there are these differences. They can't all be accurate, especially in those small things. But what about the big things? Here's a big thing. In the Gospel of John, Jesus makes claims for himself as a divine being. Jesus goes around in Galilee and in Jerusalem claiming to be divine. He claims that he is equal with God. I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. I am is the name that God gave himself when talking to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. Jesus says before Abraham was, Abraham lived 1,800 years earlier. And Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. The Jewish opponents know exactly what he's saying. They pick up stones to stone him to death. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Whoa. That's in the Gospel of John. Jesus repeatedly makes divine claims for himself. And here's a striking factoid. He never does so in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. How can that be? As Mike pointed out, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are based on earlier sources. We know some of these sources. Mark, Q, M, L. In none of these sources does Jesus make these claims for himself. Only in the last gospel, written 65 years after Jesus' death, does anybody have Jesus declare himself as God. How could Jesus himself have actually called himself God, gone around in his ministry calling himself God in Galilee and in Jerusalem, spent his ministry talking about himself as a divine being? How could that have happened? And our earliest sources don't talk about it. This wasn't important enough even to mention? It would be the most important thing you could possibly say about Jesus. He called himself God. But he does it only in our last gospel. You see why it's important whether these gospels are accurate. Did Jesus call himself God or not? Thank you very much.